Alright, hello everyone. Today I'm going to be going over the Paleomons meta as of Slate 17 in preparation for the upcoming Pet Mods Premier League. I just wanted to do an overview of how the meta is looking now, especially in comparison to last year, so that players who haven't played the mod since then can get a better feel for how things are. I have here with me my personal viability ranking. This is also the ranking that was used for the submission post, though there are, I think, one slight difference, which we'll get to when we get to it. But for now, let's just get right into it. So starting off, the absolute top of the meta, and this should not be surprising to anyone who played last year, it's Armaldo. Armaldo has a lot of things going for it. The biggest thing is the amount of utility it gets, right? You have Knockoff, you have Rapid Spin, you have Stealth Rock, and you have U-Turn. You're not going to usually run every single one of these on one set because you want to be running Earthquake. Ground coverage is extremely good in this meta. Outside of flying types and a couple first flight mons, all of which are offensive, there's very few ground resists, so you very much want to be running ground moves when you can. But Armaldo, the biggest thing it has is this utility and the fact that it is essentially uncontested as a ground type in the meta. Brawlutra, Caraguana, Letharium, they all have value as bulky grounds, but they are so much more flawed when compared to Armaldo. Armaldo with Intimidate and this bulk and typing just has everything going for it. There's really no reason not to run Armaldo right now. And especially when you look at the hazard setters in the meta, pretty much all of these lose to Armaldo, right? Archeops loses to Armaldo. Bastiodon loses to Armaldo. Caracosta loses to Armaldo. Kabutops, another big one, loses to Armaldo, right? Armaldo just absolutely destroys pretty much every hazard setter in the meta. The only one that it doesn't like outright beat with stabs alone is like Icaruff, but Icaruff hates getting its boots knocked off, and I've never seen a Stealth Rock Icaruff. I'm sure it's viable, but people don't really run it, so it's not worth considering. But aside from that matchup, I mean, it pretty much beats everything. So Armaldo, easily the best mod in the meta right now. You should be running this on basically every team. You could probably run something else on hyper offense and on offense in general. Well, even on offense, I mean, you can run this. This mon has so much set variety. You can run assault vest, you can run leftovers, you can run choice scarf. I haven't seen choice band, but that's probably fine too. The main issue for that set is Tornadus, because you don't really have a way of threatening it without Stone Edge, but you don't really want to be clicking Stone Edge. So. But aside from that, I mean, Armaldo is a powerhouse of a mon, has basically no downsides to when running it, and it is probably both the best hazard setter and the best hazard removal in the meta right now. So moving on to the A+ tier, we have Caracosta. Now, this Pokemon actually just got nerfed. Its special defense was decreased by 10 points. However, it still does the same thing that it did last year, which is be a very, very bulky, specially defensive mon, right? You run Black Sludge, you run its signature ability Leatherback, which is unchanged, and you run something like Gunk Shot, Knockoff, Stealth Rock, Trash Compactor. One note, Trash Compactor still cannot be searched for in the team builder, so you just need to scroll down and select it from here. You can also run this as a Rapid Spinner. It's not a bad option for that, but generally you want to be running Armaldo in that role, and it's a little bit anti-synergy as well to be running Rapid Spin on Caracosta, just with how Trash Compactor works. So usually Stealth Rock is going to be getting more value for you. But you run this with, full special defense investment, and this is a very solid special wall. The main drawbacks compared to last year are, one, it's a little less all-around bulky, so there are some matchups that will change based on this. One of these ones that does change, Yeezel, I think does a little bit more with Moonblast, which isn't great. But generally, I mean, this is still a very good Pokemon. The other big drawback is just that we have introduced new special attackers who do quite well into it. Combissa with Choice Specs does two-shot Caracosta, so you do have to run a separate Pokemon to deal with that. As well as Feel Ice. Feel Ice with Choice Specs as well. Choice Specs Frost Breath is doing about 45 to 50, so you don't really want to be relying on Caracosta as your Feel Ice answer. But aside from that, most of the meta Caracosta does pretty well into, and so it's still a very premier special wall. So moving on, we have Combissa. Now, this Pokemon actually just got nerfed in preparation for Pet Mods Premier League, and I'm very glad that it did because this thing was way too strong. It's still very good, even with 10 less special attack, but basically, the power of this Pokemon is its very high special stats with compound eyes. So you can run Life Orb, you can run Choice Scarf, or you can run Choice Specs. Every single one of these sets is good and has its own strengths. And then you run Fire Blast, you run Focus Blast, you run Earth Power. These are pretty much non-negotiable. These are stabs, and they're very, very strong. And then Earth Power you absolutely need for Kabutops. But you run those three, and then your last slot is usually going to be U-Turn. You can run other things on it as well, though. You get a ton of coverage. There are plenty of options. You could run something like Giga Drain if you wanted. You could run Overheat for a little more power. You could run Hurricane. I'm not really sure who that would be hitting, but you never know. It's an option. Or you can run Morning Sun, which is actually a pretty interesting option on Life Orb sets. You will be getting plenty of free turns with Combissa as opponents switch out to their answer, something like Kabutops. So on a Life Orb set, Morning Sun I think could be very justifiable, just to keep your health up and to make yourself more of a threat in late game. But generally, that's what you run on Combissa. And then this just does so much damage. There are very few reliable counterplay options to this. Choice Scarf sets have a few more. Like Caracosta cleanly answers Choice Scarf Combissa. And once it's locked into a move, there's plenty of options. Even offensive mons like Magnastone can pretty easily answer it if it's locked into, for example, a fire move. But you do have to be very careful around Combissa. Firefighting are very good stabs. And Earth Power blows up non-Assault Vest Kabutops, which is why Assault Vest Kabutops has actually seen a rise recently. But generally, the biggest counterplay option to Combissa is Kabutops. Kabutops obviously resists both of your stabs, has Regenerator to switch in over and over and over, and has pretty good special bulk. So, especially with an Assault Vest, this is switching into you time after time, and you pretty much need to remove Kabutops with something else in order for Combissa to get value in that matchup. But if you play correctly and they're not running Assault Vest, you can kill it with an Earth Power or two. But that doesn't often happen, so you do have to just play carefully around Kabutops. But aside from the Kabutops matchup, Combissa is an extremely strong special attacker. It is probably the single best offensive mon in the meta, and it absolutely needs to be prepped for on every team. So next we have Kabutops. Now, those of you who played last year are probably very familiar with this mon, and actually quite a lot has changed with it since last year. First off, it's been nerfed quite a bit. Most of these nerfs happened during the Pet Mods Premier League, so I'm sure you remember. It now has less special attack. Its Bloodstream signature was nerfed, and it is a lot worse now. Not just because of those nerfs, actually, but because new counterplay options have been added. So the biggest problem for Kabutops is the new addition Dreadnought. Dreadnought is both counterplay and a competition for Kabutops. It is another fat Regenerator water type, has way more bulk than Kabutops. It's water steel instead of water poison, which provides quite a few advantages. The only downside is, of course, the worst Combissa matchup. But outside of Combissa and Felice, who I'll get to in a bit, Dreadnought is better into basically everything else than Kabutops defensively, as well as into Kabutops itself. Offensive Kabutops is basically dead, because after losing Earth Power, it just has absolutely no way of threatening Dreadnought or opposing Kabutops. So, for the most part, you will only be seeing defensive pivot Kabutops. Calm Mind sets are dead in the water, as are offensive Life Orb sets, for the most part. Though you can still run Life Orb, but if you're running Life Orb, it's going to be like a pseudo-utility set. Like, you can run Life Orb with, like, Bloodstream, Surf, Knockoff, and U-Turn, or something along those lines. You might see a set like this around, but generally people are going to be running utility Kabutops, mainly because it's the only set that gets value these days, but then also because you really, really do need an answer to Combissa, and Kabutops is the best option for that. So you'll usually see some combination of stabs, flip turn rather than U-turn, and then knockoff and rapid spin. This is the most common set on Kabutops, and it obviously does have some clear downsides, like not having a strong water move can make it harder to force out certain mons, but Generally, mons like Bastiodon being less common makes it easier to run a set like this, and Knockoff and Rapid Spin are so valuable they're very hard to pass up. So this is generally what you'll see on Kabutops, and it's still a very strong Pokemon. It's a lot less strong than it used to be. It used to be much better, but these days it's mostly just a utility pivot, and can occasionally be used offensively, but usually is not because there are better options. And finally, for the A+ tier, we have Yeezle. This is completely unchanged from last year, but Carracosta got nerfed, which is a buff to Yeezle. This runs the exact same sets it used to. You can run Choice Band with First Flight, pretty much always using First Flight here. Volt Absorb just isn't getting as much value, and with how strong ground moves are, having that ground resist on your team is very valuable. Running First Flight, you'll have something like Bolt Beak, Play Rough. The third slot is completely interchangeable here. I've been running Drill Peck for Armaldo, and then U-Turn. And this is a very hard set to slow down. Outside of Armaldo, there's very little counterplay that likes switching in repeatedly. But you can also run Choice Specs, which does get the jump on Armaldo because you actually have the option to run Thunderbolt, Moonblast, and then Flamethrower, which is very strong into Armaldo because, for one, you're immune to Intimidate. You're a special attacker. It does not bother you. And even though your special attack is a little lower, because of that Intimidate avoidance, Flamethrower is doing much more damage than something like Drill Peck. Also, because most Armaldos are running physical defense investment, you want to be using special attacks to break through it. So this is a very strong set as well. You'll see this pretty often. It can run Volt Switch. I would not recommend it. There are so many electric immunes in the meta. It is very hard to get value with Volt Switch right now. And I'll get into more of those later, but obviously Armaldo and Carracosta are the two biggest ones. So generally, you do really want to be running U-Turn even on Specs Yeezle. But yes, this is still a very strong offensive mon. It does exactly what it did last year. The speed tier is elite. There are very few mons that outspeed it, and the new ones are, for the most part, bad. Espathra, not good. Ulticombat got majorly nerfed, and it's much rarer now. Nurturaptor has been bad and is just basically unviable right now. So there's very few Pokemon that actually outspeed Yeezle, and it can get a lot of value because of that. Alright, so moving on to the A tiers, we have Archeops. Now, Archeops is unchanged from last year. It does the same thing it did then, but of course it is still a very strong offensive threat, and has a wide variety of sets that can be run on it. Its stabs are very strong, with Rock and Fighting being borderline unresisted in the meta. Close Combat and Stone Edge are very strong moves. Even mons like Armaldo really don't want to be switching into a Stone Edge, because if you critical hit, it's losing about half its health if you're Choice Band. And you can run Choice Band. You can also run other sets. You can run Scarf on this, though that's a little rare. 110 speed is usually good enough. You can run Leftovers. Leftovers utility sets are very solid. I've also seen Stealth Rock, though usually you do want Earthquake, so maybe you'd be dropping U-Turn in that case and run 3 attacks and U-Turn. Life Orb is a consideration. I think generally you wear yourself down too quickly that way, and Pokemon like Amistar and Eleffigy can cause big problems for Life Orb sets, just because they wall you long enough that you end up dying before doing meaningful damage. So generally, you want longevity on Archeops, so Leftovers is very valuable if you don't want to be running a choice item. And of course, First Flight is great. It makes it one of very few ground resists, so you are able to get a lot of value, such as predicting Armaldo using Earthquake and switching in. With First Flight active, Armaldo does not have a good way of threatening you, period. U-Turn doesn't do much damage, Knockoff doesn't do much damage, though of course you do lose your item, and Stone Edge does basically nothing. So you can very easily pivot in on Armaldo a couple times a match with Archeops thanks to First Flight, and that makes it quite valuable as an offensive pivot in the meta, considering how strong Armaldo is. Of course, Archeops is also just a behemoth offensively in its own right. Close Combat and Stone Edge are such strong moves, and you can get a lot of value into anything but the fattest of teams with Archeops. And our second and only other Pokemon in the A tier is Dreadnought. Now, I touched on this mon a little bit during Kabutops' section, but basically, Dreadnought is just extremely bulky and has Regenerator. So you'll run Leftovers or Heavy Duty Boots on it, and then you will just run Surf, Flash Cannon. It doesn't really matter what moves you run in this slot. The only move that does matter is Wish. Dreadnought is by far the best Wish passer in the meta, even though it doesn't have pivoting. Just by virtue of having Regenerator and this absurd level of bulk, you can get so much value wish passing with Dreadnought, and you absolutely want to be taking advantage of that, unless you're running Assault Vest. You can also run Assault Vest on Dreadnought, and in that case you would not be running Wish, you would be running 4 attacks, but this Pokemon's offensive move pool is just truly ridiculous. You have moves like Ice Beam, you have moves like Earth Power. What else could you run on this? You could run Power Gem if you wanted. That lets you hit flying types. Though usually Ice Beam is better. Power Gem is only really valuable for Icaruff. Though that can be considered since Assault Vest Dreadnought is basically a hard stop to Calm Mind Icaruff sets. Even +6 Boom Burst is only doing like 40%-ish. Unfortunately, you have lost access to Roar. Or was it Dragon Tail? I think it was Dragon Tail. This used to have access to Dragon Tail. That was just ridiculous. No setup Pokemon could make any progress into Dreadnought teams. It was way too strong, so Dragon Tail was removed. But Dreadnought is still very strong. Assault Vest sets are just a little bit worse without Dragon Tail. You do still have moves like Super Fang, though, to make progress even into setup mons. But generally, you'll be seeing Leftovers or Heavy Duty Boots with Wish. Moving on to the A- tiers, we have Ulti-Combat. Now, this is quite the fall from last year, but Ulti-Combat did receive a major nerf with 15 less attack. This has influenced a lot of matchups and made it much harder to break through teams in the same way it used to. However, this speed tier and typing are still elite, and you can absolutely still run Ulti-Combat on teams exactly as you used to. With something like Leftovers or a Terrain Seed, Ulti-Combat is still very good on grassy terrain teams with Grassy Seed. And you will run Swords Dance, and you will run Dual Wing Beat, or if you are running Grassy Seed, you will run Acrobatics, Close Combat, and Knock Off. And this set is still extremely hard to slow down. There are very few defensive counterplay options. Aside from just neutral, bulky walls, Bastiodon can handle this pretty well now that it's received the attack nerf. Bastiodon does win the 1v1, I believe. And there are other Pokemon as well that can handle you somewhat well. Obviously, Ghost types, not so much. But something like Enamorus will be able to eat a hit and kill you back. Maybe not with the Grassy Seed defense boost, I actually have not seen that interaction. But Nymphomane as well is very threatening, though its physical bulk isn't the highest, so with a little bit of chip, Acrobatics should be able to finish it off. The point is, Ulti-Combat is still a very strong offensive option in the meta. You can also still run Choice Band on it, but compared to last year, it's definitely weaker, and that is why it is lower on the viability ranking. Next up, we have Aerodactyl. With Ulti-Combat's nerf, Aerodactyl has been shadow buffed, since Ulti-Combat did unfortunately win that matchup due to Scrappy. However, Aerodactyl is now stronger, since it can beat pretty much every viable physical attacker. The only exception being Armaldo isn't the greatest for it, because obviously, being a ghost flying type, you are very, very weak to knock off. But thankfully, you can still play around the Armaldo matchup with Dual Wing Beat and Will-O-Wisp, being ways of making easy progress into Armaldo. Aerodactyl is also probably the best defogger in the tier right now. Icaruff is also solid, but Aerodactyl gets a lot more value with defensive sets. Generally, Icaruff is better off running offensive sets, or offensive sets. So if you're running a defensive flying type, Aerodactyl or Tornadus would be your best options. But I think Aerodactyl is slightly better in the defog role, since it does have access to Roost. And you can run this a lot of different ways. Obviously, Poltergeist is a very strong stab move, and having 130 speed and Will-O-Wisp makes this pretty much completely shut down all physical attackers not named Tyrantrum. And even Tyrantrum has to worry about getting burned, so it can't switch in freely. So Aerodactyl is a very strong utility pivot. You can also run U-Turn on it, I forgot to mention. It's a very strong utility pivot and fast defensive mon. You can also run offensive sets on it. Obviously, 105 attack and 130 speed are not too bad, so you can very much make offensive sets work, though you do have to run teammates that can handle dark types. But yeah, our Aerodactyl is a very strong mon in the meta right now, and I expect to see it a lot in the tournament. Next up, we have a new Pokemon here. This is Thelice. Now, Thelice has introduced something that did not previously exist to the meta, and that is a immediately powerful special ice type. Salazzle and Arctobus are both fine right now, especially Salazzle. Salazzle, after its buff, has become much better, but Salazzle usually runs Nasty Plot sets, whereas Thelice does not have setup, so it runs Choice Specs. And the power of Thelice is Choice Specs, Technician, Frost Breath. This move pretty much carries Thelice's kit. It is absurdly powerful with Technician, does so much damage. You need an Ice Resist in order to switch into it properly, and not just an Ice Resist, you need a bulky Ice Resist. So if you look at the top tiers, there are options, thankfully. We have Kabutops, which is a fine answer, especially to your stabs. We have Dreadnought, which answers Frost Breath just fine. Unfortunately, it is weak to fighting, and so it will take about 60% from Specs Chi Shift, so it cannot switch in safely. It will, if they have a teammate that is resistant to fighting, it can switch in just to tank the hit and pivot out, but obviously with good play, you can break through Dreadnought cores pretty easily. And so you will run your stabs, you will run, I've seen Vacuum Wave is a pretty solid option. It lets you take care of Pokemon like Archeops, or I guess specifically Scarf Archeops, since you outspeed Archeops normally, but it does let you handle Crobat, as well as Nurturaptor, though that mon is not really being run, and Salazzle, though Salazzle doesn't really immediately threaten you anyway, but people run Vacuum Wave regardless because there's not really a better move to run. You don't really get any coverage. You could run Chilling Water. I think that's a little silly, though. It doesn't really help with any of your problem matchups. You do not get Freeze Dry, so you cannot run that. And I suppose you could run Knockoff in this slot. It's not the worst option, though it would exclusively be for utility. And then the last slot is pretty much always Parting Shot. And this is generally what you'll see on Choice Specs sets. I would not run Attack Investment even with Knockoff because you're not using it to deal damage anyway, and you would rather have a little bit more longevity. So Thelice is pretty much carried by its access to Frost Breath. If the opponent has a bulky Ice Resist that is not afraid of Chi Shift, something like Kabutops or Arctobus, it is not going to make progress into those teams. But as long as that bulky Ice Resist is taken care of, Thelice can make absolutely massive progress, and you will very often see this Pokemon running away with games, because if they do not have a defensive answer, there are not very many offensive answers. So you really do want to have a bulky Ice Resist right now in the meta. Alright, moving on, we have two Gourgeist forms in the A- tier. The first one here is going to be Gourgeist Regular. No, sorry, not Gourgeist Regular. Gourgeist Large. And this is the Grassy Terrain setter. Now, with the nerf to Ulti-Combat and the nerf to Bastiodon, both of whom fit very well on Grassy Terrain teams, Grassy Terrain has gotten a little worse since last year. However, it is still a very strong playstyle, especially since Terrain is for the most part uncontested, though there is one new Pokemon that we will be talking about shortly that does now contest Grassy Terrain. However, for the most part, there are not many ways of punishing Grassy Terrain teams, and so Gourgeist can still get a lot of value. Despite its stats being mediocre, Grassy Glide is a very strong move in the meta, which is surprising considering you only have 78 attack. However, there are so many very fast offensive Pokemon that are weak to grass. So we have Crobat. We have, especially the biggest one, Archeops. These two are both very weak to Grassy Glide and can be taken down very quickly. Magnastone as well is another offensive Pokemon that is very weak to Grassy Glide, and Nymphomane as well. So Grassy Glide can get a lot of value as a priority option. You run it similar to Rillaboom, though it is obviously less immediately offensive, so you will mostly be using it in a support role. You can run high horsepower. As I said, ground coverage is very valuable in this meta. You get moves like Pain Split, Synthesis. You can run Swords Dance if you want Toxic is a very good option on Gourgeist. A lot of its switch-ins don't like eating a Toxic, though a lot of its switch-ins are also Poison and Steel types, so High Horsepower might be getting value there over Toxic. But generally, you'll be running this as a support Pokemon, and then the rest of your team will benefit from grassy terrain. The other Gourgeist form here is, I believe, though I'll have to check. Yes, that is Gourgeist Small. So Gourgeist Small is unchanged from last year. However, with Ulti Combat's nerf, it lost one of its best counterplay options. So teams are hard-pressed to find answers for this Pokemon right now. Obviously, Ulti Combat is still an answer. However, with its nerf, it is much less common and much harder to slot on teams. So running faster offensive answers is pretty much off the table, unless you are running Aerodactyl. Aerodactyl is a fine answer. But you will run Swords Dance on this, and then you will run Fairy Aura boosted Play Rough, you will run the Life Orb item, and then you can run Wood Hammer if you want. You can also run Power Whip, and then you can run High Horsepower. And this prevents Pokemon like Venipleura from answering you properly, because they just get absolutely blown up by High Horsepower. And this is a very strong cleaner in the meta. Probably the single strongest cleaner in the meta, actually, because defensive counterplay is extremely limited. I'm trying to think of answers right now. Armaldo doesn't like eating a Power Whip at +2, or I guess +1 if it switches in. It's still taking like 50%. It's not a good answer. Tornadus is probably the best answer in the meta right now, but Tornadus lacks reliable recovery. So despite having a very good defensive profile for answering Gourgeist, it won't be around for the whole match. So it is very easy to break through teams even with Tornadus, if you play properly around them, and that is why Gourgeist is so good as a cleaner in the current meta. Next up, we have Icaruff. Now, this Pokemon has both gotten better and worse since last year. It's a little hard to gauge its viability at the moment, actually. It's not run very often. And that is mainly because of the addition of Dreadnought. Dreadnought and Espathra are both new Steel types that have good matchups into Icaruff, Dreadnought especially. It is finally the bulky, specially defensive Steel that the meta was waiting for, and now that it exists, Icaruff is much, much worse, because you can't get away with running Calm Mind, Boom Burst, Heat Wave, Encore like you used to be able to. Now, this set is completely stonewalled by Dreadnought. You can still break past it with enough Calm Mind boosts, but the fact that Dreadnought can pivot around it so freely makes it much harder to get value immediately with Icaruff. And non-Calm Mind sets are completely unable to break past Dreadnought. You will not be seeing, Boom Burst, Soul Wind, Encore, Roost these days, because this has no way of getting value into Dreadnought. It just comes in, clicks Stealth Rock, you have no way of preventing it, and then it switches out to a teammate, and you have made zero progress, right? Boom Burst is doing like 10% at most, and it's sad. It's honestly sad how little this can do to Dreadnought. Now, thankfully, you can still run defensive sets with Defog and the heavy-duty boots. This is still a fine set. Good, even. You can run it with speed investment, or you can go full physically defensive. Pokemon like Tauros, that this answers very well, are unfortunately not as common in the meta, but Bastiodon is also not as common in the meta, and Bastiodon used to be the best answer to this kind of Icaruff set, because it was a Stealth Rock setter that Icaruff could not force out. And in fact, Icaruff would die if it tried to 1v1 Bastiodon. So less Bastiodon usage does mean Icaruff is better as a defogger, but unfortunately, offensive Icaruff is much worse since the addition of Dreadnought. Next up, we have Magnastone. This is another new Pokemon compared to last year, and it sort of takes the role that was filled by Life Orb Kabutops as a mid-speed, very high special attacker. So you will generally see Life Orb Predator, which this ability Predator is basically the Shell Bell item as an ability. And you will see its signature move, Ferris Force, which is a very strong move as it enables it to properly 1v1 Bastiodon without needing to predict, or sorry, not Bastiodon. It allows it to 1v1 Dreadnought without needing to predict into it. And then you have Thunderbolt, and this slot is flexible. You will often see Earth Power to properly threaten Caracosta, mainly, though Ferris Force can actually do about 40 to Caracosta, so it's a very winnable matchup, especially if you run Spikes instead. And then you have Volt Switch, which is usually run, but is not often clicked because, unfortunately, Caracosta and especially Armaldo are big stopgaps to Volt Switch. It is basically impossible to run Volt Switch effectively in this meta due to those two. And so, honestly, you could consider dropping Volt Switch outright in order to run Earth Power and Spikes. And this is the most common set, either this or Volt Switch. And this can get a lot of value into teams because these stabs are very hard to resist in the current meta due to the lack of ground types that are not Armaldo. Because Armaldo is so common, Magnastone gets a lot better, because Ferris Force obviously hits neutrally, and being a 110 base power move, any Armaldo that is not running Assault Vest really does not want to eat more than one of those in a game, so you can get a lot of value by just spamming Ferris Force and breaking through teams that way. You also have Thunderbolt, and since you can threaten Armaldo pretty effectively, as well as Caracosta, because Caracosta is also taking a lot of damage from Ferris Force and a lot of damage from Earth Power, you are able to click Thunderbolt and deal a lot of damage that way if they have, let's say, a Rock Resist like Dreadnought, who does not switch into well to Thunderbolt at all. Magnastone just gets a lot of value into teams. You also don't need to run Life Orb. If you're running pivot sets or utility sets, especially with Spikes, you can also run Leftovers. And this just gives it more longevity. You can also run Heavy Duty Boots because Predator basically takes the role of Leftovers on a set like this. It is healing about 5% per turn on average, as long as you're attacking. And so that is basically a Leftovers, and that way you can run Boots to be a more effective pivot, and then you would run something like Spikes and Volt Switch because Earth Power is not really getting value without Life Orb. You're not really doing more than like 35 to Caracosta at that point, and you would rather just be clicking Ferris Force. So overall, Magnastone is a very strong offensive pivot in the current meta, and it can be seen on a wide variety of team styles. Next up, we have Tornadus. This is another new addition, and was basically made as a hard counter to standard utility Armaldo. A heavy-duty boots Tornadus set has absolutely no way of being threatened by standard Armaldo, thanks to Sticky Hold. Because of this, knockoff does pitiful damage, and you'll usually see something like Bleak Windstorm, Sludge Bomb, Defog, U-Turn. And this is a very effective defogger because of how common Armaldo and Kabutops are as Stealth Rock setters, as well as Caracosta, who again cannot knock off your boots, and therefore cannot really effectively threaten you. And you have Bleak Windstorm, which is a very unique signature. The cutoff part here says it sets the target's ability to Delta Stream, which is very interesting because it not only functions similarly to Core Enforcer in that it suppresses the opponent's ability, but it also replaces that ability with one that is beneficial to you, because Delta Stream removes the flying weaknesses of all active Pokemon, which means that even though the opponent is the one with the ability, you are actually the one benefiting from it with your flying typing on Tornadus. And without flying weaknesses, the only weakness this Pokemon has is Psychic, and Psychic types are very rare in the current meta. There's only a few, and Amistar often isn't even running Psychic moves. Espathra is very uncommon, as is Sigilif, so the only Psychic type you'll be seeing frequently is Elephagy. And if the opponent is not running an Elephagy, then they have no way of hitting Tornadus super effectively while Delta Stream is active. As well, Bleak Windstorm just completely blows up Elephagy, so they can't just switch that in. You can also run Nasty Plot sets on Tornadus, and you can run that with Focus Blast. And the benefit to this set is that it allows you to threaten Dreadnought, because normally your stabs are completely ruined by Dreadnought. Thankfully, Bleak Wind does actually remove Regenerator, so Dreadnought can't just come in on you for free. If you are clicking Bleak Wind, then it is unable to regenerate its health, and especially if you have Focus Blast, that means you can get permanent chip on the Dreadnought, which is very valuable in a lot of circumstances, and makes Tornadus much better into Dreadnought than you would first assume from its typing. This is a very strong Pokemon. The main thing holding it back is that it does not have recovery and cannot afford to hold leftovers. So it will be getting worn down, even with this very, very stellar bulk. It will eventually get worn down, and at that point, you will be vulnerable to whatever you were using it to answer, something like Armaldo or Caracosta. So you do just want to bear that in mind when you're running Tornadus, that it will not last forever. The final Pokemon in the A- tier is Tyrantrum. Now, on the submission post, I believe Tyrantrum was in the A tier. However, my opinion on it has shifted slightly since then, and this A- tier is, I believe, more similar to where it was placed on the viability ranking after last year's PetMods Premier League. So this is, if anything, closer to what y'all would have expected, rather than farther away. So Tyrantrum does exactly what it did last year. It is a very, very strong Dragon Dance sweeper, thanks to Strongjaw and Draconic Ren. Both of these moves are very powerful, Draconic Ren and Crunch are very powerful with Strongjaw. And then you have quite a few options as your final move. I often run Earthquake because it allows you to threaten Steel types, as well as Bastiodon, the most common fairy. You can also run Iron Head, which, now that Gourgeist is appearing about as much, if not more often, than Bastiodon, it can be a lot more valuable to run Iron Head, because Earthquake does absolutely nothing into Gourgeist. And then you will have usually you'll be running Adamant. You don't really need Jolly. And this is a very strong sweeper. Its main issue is that it does not have a way of effectively threatening Armaldo. You can just click Crunch, but that only does about 30%, and Armaldo can easily heal off that damage with leftovers. And obviously, anytime Armaldo comes in, you are forced to switch out because U-Turn is doing 60% or more. An offensive Armaldo can KO you outright with a Choice Band U-Turn. And so you don't really have the choice or the luxury of staying in. And so that is the main thing holding Tyrantrum back right now, because realistically, at +1, this has no defensive counterplay. There is nothing that answers this effectively. However, getting to +1 and staying there is very, very hard because of how common Intimidate is in the meta, especially with Armaldo. And so the main thing holding Tyrantrum back right now, despite its really, really stellar offensive profile, is Armaldo. If Armaldo were to become weaker, then I think Tyrantrum would become somewhat of a problem in the meta, but right now, it just doesn't match up very well. Alright, next up we have the B+ tier. Now, starting from here, we are getting into less viable Pokemon, so I will be spending a little bit less time on each individual Pokemon. But starting right off with Aurorus, we have this is a very strong Nasty Plot user in the current meta. Aurorus doesn't really have much of any defensive counterplay. Draco Meteor is a very spammable attack, especially when you have Spectorate Hyper Voice to blow up any fairy types that try to come in on you. The main counterplay options are Dark types, especially Caracosta, as well as Unga Bungus can be a solid answer. And that's about it, though. I mean, it's really just those two. Lapras would be a good answer, but unfortunately, Lapras is basically unviable in the current meta. You will not see it on most teams. And so, what you can do is you can run Colberberry, because if they're not using a Dark type, they will be using a Dark type move. Knockoff is very common in this meta, and so Colberberry on Aurorus completely flips matchups at times, such as Armaldo. They will click Knockoff when you're at like 50%, thinking it will take you out, but instead you live, it only does like 30%, and then you kill them back with Draco. And then, of course, you have, not Slack Off. Which move does this one have? That's right, Recover. You also have Recover, which makes your bulk all that much more impressive. You don't necessarily need full speed investment. I'm sure you can run the calculations yourself for exactly how much speed you need. Running bulk is very valuable on this, of course. With how much natural bulk it has, you can easily win a ton of trades, even into Pokemon that can hit you super effectively, just because of how much immediate power you have. Next up, we have Bastiodon. Another big fall off compared to last year. But after Bastiodon's HP was reverted to its pre-buff level, Bastiodon is much worse. It does lose quite a lot more 1v1s, and it's also made worse by the fact that we have much more special attackers in the meta now, so you cannot just run physical defense investment and wall the entire meta. Pokemon like Combissa are a big issue for Bastiodon. Also, Magnus Stone can pivot around it freely. There are quite a few options. Nymphomane as well is able to hit it super effectively with Water Stab. And generally, there are just more options for special attackers that overall make physical defensive Bastiodon a little bit worse off. However, it is still a good Pokemon. Magic Bounce is an amazing ability, and Petroglyph is a very good move, of course being a Torch Song clone. So you can still run the exact same sets you used to, 3 attacks with Stealth Rock, and other variations of that, and Bastiodon can still put in a lot of work as a tank. Next up we have Crobat. This Pokemon is unchanged from last year, and it is still a strong special attacker. Usually you'll see choice specs, though it can also run leftovers pivot sets, and then you have Dark Pulse, Earth Power. This slot is flexible. It can run Cross Poison to actually threaten Gourgeist, which is pretty valuable in the current meta. Even though it is a physical attack and only 70 base power, being 4 times super effective means you can still threaten Gourgeist pretty well with it. And then you have U-Turn. And this is the most standard Crobat set, but it's not the only one, and this is a flexible Mon that is a little worse now that it has more competition as a special attacker, but is absolutely still viable. Next up, we have Enamorus. This is a very interesting new Pokemon, because it pretty much single-handedly enables Trick Room as a playstyle. Its signature ability, Gente's Protection, gives it immunity to indirect damage, basically the effects of Magic Guard, while in Trick Room, which makes it very good with Life Orb, though you can also run heavy-duty boots if you want to be more careful, or you want to run it outside of Trick Room. However, even outside of dedicated Trick Room teams, you probably still want to run offensive Trick Room sets on this because of Springtide Storm, which resets Trick Room if the move KOs the target. And being a very strong fairy move, that's going to happen more often than not, so you will have the opportunity to reset Trick Room, and because of that, you do want Trick Room to be up. Now, I usually run in the 3rd slot Zen Headbutt, and this is for the Kabutops matchup, because Fairy Fire is of course walled by Water Poison, and Zen Headbutt at least gives you a way of breaking through it. Your special attack is somewhat high. You can run Earth Power if you want. However, 135 attack is more impressive, and Kabutops is usually running special defense investment, so Zen Headbutt is doing a lot more for you there. And then in the last slot, you want Trick Room, and this is the most standard Enamorus set, with max HP, max attack, Brave. And this is very solid. You can get a lot of value out of Enamorus this way, even if it's not on a dedicated Trick Room team, but we also have quite a few good Trick Room attackers in this meta. Let me see if I have my Trick Room team easily accessible. I do. We have Pokemon like Bastiodon, who has very impressive coverage to make up for its somewhat low base power stabs. We have Golduko, who does absurd damage at +2. We have Vulcanist, who is completely unwallable if you do not have an Icaruff, but even then, Ancient Power lets you break through that one. And without Icaruff, this claims as many KOs as you have turns of Trick Room, essentially. A very strong option, and there are other options as well for Trick Room abusers. So Enamorus is a very solid Pokemon, and pretty much single-handedly enables Trick Room on its own. Next up, we have Elephagy. This is unchanged from last year. It is still a very solid physical wall and hazard Hazard Setter. Sorry, it does not have Rapid Spin, unlike Great Tusk, but it does have Stealth Rock. So you'll usually see utility sets like this with Stabs, Knockoff, and Stealth Rock, but it can also run Choice Scarf very effectively, and it can also run Choice Band, so though that is not seen as often. The value of Choice Scarf is that you can very easily threaten with just these moves here a lot of the very fast Pokemon. Crobat gets blown up by close combat, Ulti Combat, Ivory Slash destroys it, etc., etc. There are pretty much everything here doesn't like eating these attacks. Even Gourgeist gets dealt a ton of damage by Ivory Slash, and so Leafage is a very strong option as a Scarfer. It is very solid speed control. Next up we have Nymphomane. This one is interesting because its standard sets, or what you would expect it to run, are actually not that good. And that's mainly because of Dreadnought. Nymphomane has no way of threatening Dreadnought. It does not have Focus Blast, it does not have Aura Sphere, it has not even Psychic Noise. It has no way of threatening Dreadnought. However, this is actually fine because what you can run on it are Substitute Pain Split sets. And these sets are so much more effective than you would expect them to be. They have been run to a lot of success recently, and then you'll run something like Alluring Voice and Sparkling Aria. And this set is very, very, very solid, because thanks to Pain Split, you can actually wear down walls very quickly, and even Pokemon like Dreadnought cannot afford to switch in, because generally you'll be clicking Substitute, Dreadnought cannot break that easily, and then you have Pain Split, and that allows you to wear down Dreadnought's HP and keep your own HP high, and this is a pretty effective wall breaker, thanks to the combination of Substitute and Pain Split. It can be a little weak into offense teams, mainly because of that base 100 speed, but even then, thanks to Substitute, you can give yourself a lot of free turns to click your very strong Punk Rock boosted stab attacks. Next up we have Rampardos. This does what it has always done. It's usually a choice Scarfer, though you can also run other items on it. And you just click Head Smash or Stone Edge, depending on your choice. And you have Head Barrage, boosted Moonblast, and a ton of coverage. All the coverage you could ever want, thanks to Head Barrage making your special attacks physical. This is a very standard Rampardos set, and it is extremely strong. Just make sure when you're setting the EVs, do not let it put any into special attack, because Head Barrage will make all of those special attacks physical. Very strong Scarfer, pairs very well with Archeops. It has done nothing but benefit from the nerf to Bastiodon, for example. And its only real weakness is Armaldo, but even then Armaldo does not like eating a Stone Edge or a Head Smash, as well as you have Ice Beam or Flamethrower coverage for it. Next, we have Skeledirge. This one has not been used as much recently, but it is still strong. And of course, the main value is just a very, very specially bulky setup Pokemon with Torch Song, Dragon Pulse, Will-O-Wisp, and Slack-Off. This is the most standard Skeledirge set. It can get a lot of value into Pokemon that have no way of immediately threatening it. Will-O-Wisp enables it to cripple Pokemon like Armaldo that would otherwise switch in pretty much for free, and you do make a lot of progress. However, unfortunately, its matchups into the top tiers are not as good as they used to be. Pokemon like Magnastone give it a lot of trouble. Combissa as well. You do not have a way of immediately threatening it, and it does you with Focus Blast on Life Orb or special or Choice Specs sets. So unfortunately, Skeledirge is not as good as it used to be, and I think this placement may actually be a little high. This is more of a legacy ranking. Skeledirge has not been used much in the modern meta, and I think it is very possible that after the tour, it could fall down to B- or even C+. Next up, we have Stratosaur. Now, this was alluded to earlier, but it is new terrain. Stratosaur has the ability Electro Overload, which, for these purposes, is Electric Surge. And it is able to self-abuse thanks to Roosting whenever it uses an electric move. So you usually run something like Aeroblast, Thunderbolt, you can run Thunderclap, and you have Volt Switch. Now, you can also run moves like Roost or, well, it doesn't get Defog, but you can run Roost as well if you want, especially over Volt Switch, because as mentioned previously, it is very, very hard to get value with Volt Switch in this meta, thanks to Armaldo and Carcosta. However, there is some justification for running Volt Switch on Stratosaur specifically, because Stratosaur has Stab Aeroblast, which makes it basically impossible for Armaldo to switch in safely. And that removes one of the biggest answers to electric moves, and makes it a lot easier to click Volt Switch with Stratosaur. Stratosaur also enables Electric Surge as a playstyle, which Electric Terrain isn't the best in the meta. It does provide counterplay to Grassy Terrain, which is valuable, but again, as mentioned before, it is really, really hard to click electric moves in this meta. Pokemon like Heliolisk and Magnastone are your best bets for abusers, since they can generally bypass the common electric counterplay, like Carcosta and Armaldo, whether through stab moves or through just having strong coverage. But regardless, Electric Terrain is niche, but viable as a playstyle in the current meta. And closing out B+ tier, we have Ungabungus. This Pokemon does much of what it did last year. It is a strong defensive option with a lot of utility across the board. Between Knockoff, Body Press, you can run Close Combat on more offensive sets as well. It has access to Obstruct, which is a very unique move that you don't often see competitively. But Ungabungus can use it very well thanks to its high bulk and its high attack. So it can use Obstruct to lower the target's defense and then hit it with a really strong Knockoff or Close Combat or Body Press. And as well, it has Synthesis for recovery, and then it has all sorts of other utility between Leech Seed, Sucker Punch, Toxic, Taunt. There's a lot of different things you can run on Ungabungus. It is the best defensive answer to Tyrantrum, as well as one of the best answers to the many, many Pokemon that rely on their abilities, such as Kabutops and Dreadnought. It completely denies their Regenerator. It denies... It also denies Felice's Technician, making it a much better switch-in than just about anything else that isn't an Ice Resist. And it has a lot of other value in the meta right now. Now, it is kind of limited to bulky teams, which is why it is in B+, rather than higher, but it is still a very strong option on teams that can fit it. So starting off in B, we have Cardantis. This is a Pokemon that was ranked lower last year, but has, over the course of the tournament and then the year since, has proven to be a pretty strong option in the right circumstances. Generally, you're going to be running bulky utility sets with it. You can run, I believe it gets multi-attack. You can run multi-attack, you can run Poltergeist. Both are extremely strong stabs that make up for its base 88 attack. You can also run special, but usually you will run physical because you can run knockoff. And knockoff is, of course, very good, always, and you can pair that with a very strong multi-attack to get very solid neutral coverage into the meta, and also to seriously threaten Pokemon that like switching into knockoff, like Carcosta and Tornadus. Neither one of them wants to eat a stab multi-attack. Besides that, you can also run Spikes. This is one of the best Spikers in the meta. It doesn't do that well into Armaldo, unfortunately, but aside from that, it has good matchups into removal options like Kabutops, and is generally a very strong option for a Spiker, especially when you look at the other options. The only thing that really compares is Magnastone. But Magnastone doesn't have bulk, so if you want a bulky Spiker, this is pretty much your only option. And of course, you have Moonlight and Morning Sun for healing. You have a ridiculous, ridiculous amount of coverage. The coverage this Pokemon gets is absurd. It gets coverage for basically every type. Sure, it has Leech Life, why not? What about, oh, I don't know, fighting? Yup, it has like 16 fighting moves. This mod's move pool is kind of a joke. Alright, you don't have grass moves. Huge news, guys. Cardantis does not have grass coverage. This will severely impact the viability of the mon, I'm sure. Anyway, yeah, this Pokemon's move pool is ridiculous. You also have Swords Dance if you want to run more offensive sets on the right teams that can absolutely put in work, especially because instead of Sharpness, you are going to be running Misty Surge on most of these sets, to make it status immune, which is very nice for a Fatmon and is very good on bulky teams in general. You can also use it to deny Grassy Surge from Gourgeist on opposing teams, which is really good for denying Grassy Seed on ulti combat. Overall, Cardantis is a very strong option and can be used on a lot of different teams. It just needs certain builds to work. Next up in B, we have Landorus. Now, Landorus is interesting. It is pretty much only used for Sandstream, but with Sandstream, it is a very strong Pokemon. You don't see Solar Power because we don't have a Sunsetter in the meta right now, so you don't have anything to properly activate it. However, with Sandstream, it is very, very bulky and plays similarly to Tyranitar, where you just have a ridiculous amount of special bulk and can win trades very easily, especially with Nasty Plot. You can use Nasty Plot with Sandsear Storm, which is a Hydro Pump clone that can't miss in Sandstorm and has a 30% burn. It's kind of a ridiculous attack. You have Sludge Bomb, you have Earth Power, you have a lot of very good coverage options. You also have Stealth Rock, and you do have access to Knockoff as well. There's a lot this Pokemon can do, and it hasn't been explored that much since it was one of the most recent additions. But I think this has a lot of potential, especially on teams that can afford to take Sand Chip or are all immune, which we have plenty of options for that as well. We have a lot of viable Steel types and Ground types and Rock types, and we also have Gourgeist with Magic Guard. So there are plenty of options for Sandstorm immune Pokemon. We also have Sand Abusers, which I will mention later, that Landorus very much helps, but you do not need to run full Sand to run Landorus as long as your team does not mind Sand Chip. Next up, we have Moscourge. This is one of the Pokemon that was buffed after last year, and it has turned out very well. Moscourge is now much more offensive leaning on the special side. Its attack investment was removed and redistributed, I believe, into bulk and into special attack. So that 126 special attack makes it the second highest in the meta that you would reasonably see because people are not running Zen mode Telephagy. So it is also 25 points higher than the Pokemon with the highest special attack in speed, so it is much better as a fully offensive Pokemon. Moscourge can run a lot of different sets. The most common set you'll see is Nasty Plot. You want to be taking advantage of Merciless here, so you'll want teammates that can poison opponents, and then with Nasty Plot, or even without Nasty Plot, you can also run Choice Specs and just do absolutely ridiculous damage with Shadow Ball and with Sludge Bomb, or Sludge Wave in this case. More likely than not. You also have Flamethrower and Scorching Sands for coverage. A lot of very good options there. They make sure that you don't end up walled by Pokemon like Dreadnought and Kabutops, which can otherwise be a pain. Thankfully, Ghost Stab is also helpful in those matchups, so you don't necessarily need to rely on coverage, but being able to hit them super effectively is definitely valuable. The big thing holding this Pokemon back is and has always been Caracosta. However, you do have access to Corrosion if you want to use Corrosion Toxic on that one. That also is very good for Kabutops and Dreadnought that I mentioned before. There's a lot of variety with this Pokemon. The main thing holding it back is its bulk, because it would be very good with Corrosion, but it often doesn't get the chance to click Toxic more than once in a game, which can really make it struggle to get that long-term value that you really want Toxic to get. But overall, this is a very strong special attacker, and on teams that can support it properly, it makes a lot of progress. Next up, we have Amistar. This is unchanged from last year. It does exactly what it did last year. This is a stall tool. Can also be run on bulky offense with Future Sight, but it just has a lot of different utility and a ton of bulk that makes it good into neutral threats like Archeops and Ulti Combat, especially with Stab Psychic moves to threaten them, and is generally just a good regenerator pivot. It's gotten a little worse with the addition of Dreadnought, but thankfully Dreadnought didn't eat into its niche too much because it was already competing with Kabutops anyway, and so its niche was mainly providing things that Kabutops could not do, and it still does that very well. And it also has that fighting resist that Kabutops has that differentiates it from Dreadnought, so in that case, Amistar still preserves its niche. Next up, we have Pezbasil. This Pokemon is interesting. It was not very popular in tournament last year, and it hasn't really changed since then. The only major addition was Stealth Rock. It did gain a couple other utility moves like Substitute and Protect, but those aren't really relevant on its main sets. However, Stealth Rock is very nice because you can now run Leftovers, and then 3 attacks with Stealth Rock. You'll usually be running Own Tempo so that you can do better in the Armaldo and the Aerodactyl matchup. And then you have Behemoth Bash, Shadow Bone, Earthquake, or Shadow Sneak. It's up to you which one you want. And then Stealth Rock. And this is the standard Pez-Basil set. You can also run Choice Band, especially with Shadow Sneak. It is a very strong option. Shadow Sneak hits most of the very fast Pokemon super effectively. The only ones that you really miss out on, or sorry, not super effectively, but at least neutrally. The only ones you really miss out on are Crobat and Nurture Raptor, but obviously Nurture Raptor is not viable. So, and then I guess Salazzle as well. But you do have Own Tempo, so Salazzle isn't the greatest switch in, even with Intimidate, because it will not lower your attack, and you threaten Behemoth Bash. So Salazzle is still a fine matchup for Pez-Basil. This is a very good tank and brawler. You can get a lot of good trades with this, especially with that base 125 attack and very good coverage. And this is definitely a Pokemon I hope to see used a bit more this year. Next up, we have Swishy Bish. I've been pretty iffy on this Pokemon recently. Nothing has changed about it, but new additions aren't exactly good for it, especially Dreadnought. This still does what it did last year. You have Choice Band and Vicious Rend and Aerolate Body Slam. These are fine options, and they were really good because there was nothing that could switch into them, but unfortunately there now is with Dreadnought, and this has hurt Swishy Bish's viability quite a bit because you don't have a way of threatening Dreadnought, unfortunately. There's nothing in your kit that can actually threaten Dreadnought. Psychic is resisted, Rock is resisted, Steel is resisted, Ice is resisted. Dreadnought resists literally every move in your kit. The only thing you can run for is Crunch, which just, I mean, it's 80 base power coverage. It's going to be doing like 30, even off of Choice Band. So unfortunately, the Dreadnought matchup has hurt this one a lot. It used to be a lot better, especially last year, because there just wasn't anything that could deal with it. Scarf sets are still fine. They're still even good, because Flying is very strong offensively in this meta. It does very well into Pokemon like Armaldo, as well as offensive Pokemon like Multi-Combat and Archeops, especially with Vicious Rend for Archeops. But so it's still fine speed control, but as a wall breaker, it is a lot worse now with the addition of Dreadnought. Next up, we have Thundurus. Thundurus is a new addition, and it takes the special position of a Mold Breaker Electric type. What's really good about that is it means it has a good matchup into Caracosta, and Caracosta cannot block it from Volt Switching, which is very valuable. Thundurus is also the Rain setter of the meta, thanks to Wild Bolt Storm, which sets Rain when dealing damage, and again, thanks to Mold Breaker, that means you can use this on Caracosta, and Caracosta cannot block your Rain. Unfortunately, Armaldo can. And you do have Hurricane for Armaldo, but into even physically defensive Armaldo, that's only doing about 45 unboosted, which is very unfortunate damage. You do have Nasty Plot to help with that. You have Volt Switch, and you have Weather Ball, so if you can get Rain Up, you can threaten Armaldo with a powerful Weather Ball. But that's assuming you get Rain Up, and that can't always happen. So Thundurus is generally pretty good. There are a few good Rain abusers in the meta, Swishy Bish, of course, being one of them. We also have, for Swift Swim, we have Brawlutra, who is fine with Bulk Up. We have Caracosta, which could work with Shell Smash. It hasn't been tested, but it's probably fine. And we have Servacni, who is not very good. Unfortunately, this Pokemon just does not do enough damage and cannot break through walls very easily. But it has potential with Swords Dance. All of these have potential. They're just not exactly stellar. The big thing you want to be running on Rain is, of course, water types. Pokemon like Nymphomane, Pokemon like Conkeldurr, Pokemon like Swishy Bish, but all of these have big flaws. For one, every single one of them, barring Conkeldurr with Focus Blast, is walled by Dreadnought. And Dreadnought is the big problem for Rain. Thankfully, Thundurus does actually threaten Dreadnought pretty well, so you do have that as an option, but Dreadnought plus Armaldo, or Dreadnought plus Caracosta plus some ground type is going to be a big problem for you. Especially if they are running, for example, a bulky ground like Litharium or Cariguana. Thundurus just does not have a way of dealing with those effectively, besides just spamming Hurricane, which isn't going to do very much damage if they're running Special Defense Investment. And that's why Rain is kind of iffy in this meta. Generally, if you're running Thundurus, you're not actually running it for Rain. I mean, you can self-set with it, but you're not running it as a full playstyle of Rain. You're just running it to self-abuse with Hurricane and maybe Weather Ball. But it's still a strong, very strong special attacker. It has the highest special attack in the meta, and Mold Breaker is very valuable on an electric type here, so Thundurus can absolutely be used on all different sorts of teams. Next up, we have Venipleura. This is a solid Pokemon in the meta. Now that Alta Combat has been nerfed, it does actually lose the 1v1. It is crazy that there was ever a point where Alta Combat did not lose the 1v1 to Venipleura, but that did exist. Thankfully, it is no longer possible for Alta Combat to win that 1v1. I believe even if you have Poison Jab. And no Wild Charge. That being said, Venipleura is still solid as an answer to Pokemon like Aerodactyl, Pokemon like Alta Combat, and especially Yeezolt is the biggest thing that you answer very well. The most common coverage option, Drill Peck, does nothing to you, and even if it runs other coverage, it cannot hit you super effectively, which helps a lot. Unfortunately, the big downside with Venipleura is that it is weak to ground. And that really is a death sentence to its viability in a lot of ways, because despite being a physical wall, being weak to ground just, I mean, look at how many Pokemon get ground coverage here. It is kind of ridiculous. So unfortunately, it is very hard to run Venipleura because everyone is running ground coverage for Caracosta and for Kabutops and for Dreadnought. And so there are just so many answers to Venipleura that just inadvertently exist on teams that can make it very hard to get value with, but you do still have a lot of good options. You have Spikes, you have Strength Sap, you have Poison Touch with Wild Charge and Poison Jab, which of course you can get a lot of value off of that. You have U-Turn as well, which is great with Poison Touch. This is still a strong Pokemon. It can just struggle to get value in certain matchups due to how common ground moves are. Next up, we have Vulcanese. This Pokemon is completely unwallable in meta. There is nothing that walls it besides maybe specially defensive Icaruff, which is a joke. Nobody is running that. So as long as you can make up for its base 70 speed with something like Trick Room or Sticky Web or maybe Paralysis support, this Pokemon does absurd amounts of damage with Life Orb, Sheer Force boosted stabs. You have Fire Blast, you have Flamethrower, you have Earth Power, and you have Ancient Power for coverage, which is actually not that weak because you have Sheer Force, which does affect Ancient Power, boosting it by 1.3 times. That gives you like, I think, 80 base power attack roughly, and that's boosted by Life Orb. So 80 base power rock coverage is not bad at all. You also have Spikes, which you can use very effectively since you force a lot of switches with this Pokemon. If they do have something like an Icaruff, Spikes can still get value. Forces it to Defog, which gives you a free switch. There's a lot you can do with this Pokemon. It's very strong, and it is, at bare minimum, an extremely strong stall breaker. Even if you're in an offense matchup, it might not do that much, but if you're against stall, they have pretty much no answer to this Pokemon, so it can get a ton of value in the stall matchup. Next up, we have Woolifant, and speaking of stall breakers, this is another good one. Woolifant kind of plays two roles on teams. You can run bulkier sets with Leftovers and Tangling Hair, and this operates similar to Elephagy, actually, as a bulky Archeops answer. Ground Fairy typing makes it immune to, or not immune, but makes it resist Archeops' stabs. And then you have Calm Mind, which takes advantage of the free turns that gives you. You have Draining Kiss, you can also run Moonblast, and then you have Earth Power. And most importantly, you have access to Slack Off, which gives you a ton of longevity with good bulk. There's a lot you can do with this Pokemon. Ground Fairy is absolutely amazing offensively. You don't need anything other than stabs. There is Tornadus, but Tornadus does not have that much special bulk. It is only... Okay, well, it does have a good amount of special bulk, but they're not usually running special defense investment, so you can usually make up for that matchup by just clicking attacks. You can also run Power Gem if you need. More likely, you're not going to be doing that. You could be running Mystical Fire, though. And the other thing is that with Calm Mind sets, Tornadus does not have an effective way of taking you off the field. You can kind of just set up in its face, as long as they don't get a poison with Sludge Bomb, which not all of them are even running Sludge Bomb, so there's definitely opportunities there. And then you do also have access to Spikes and Stealth Rock. If you want to use this as your hazard setter, you don't necessarily need Calm Mind. You can just run Stealth Rock. And this is a pretty effective bulky hazard setter. It does well into Armaldo because of Stab Moonblast and being a special attacker, which makes it immune to Intimidate. It also does well into Kabutops, who is another common removal option because it is a ground type, and Earth Power does a ton of damage. This is a strong Pokemon. It has not been explored as much as it probably should have been, and I expect it to do very well in the Premier League. All right, moving on to the B- tiers, we're starting with Brawlutra. This is in some cases, side grade, but usually downgrade to Armaldo. You'll often see people running Rocky helmet sets, taking advantage of its physical bulk with fur coat. And then you have access to flip turn, you have close combat, you have headlong rush, very strong stab options, though unfortunately you don't really have a good way of hitting flying types. You can run Stone Edge, but that means you would be dropping spikes or stealth rock, which you usually don't want. It has been described as Armaldo with spikes, which I think is a fair comparison in some cases, since Armaldo does not have spikes, so if you want a spiker, Brawlutra is the better option. And generally, this is a solid, physically defensive Pokemon and pivot, but usually Armaldo is preferred. Next up, we have Caraguana, in a very similar boat to Brawlutra here. This is a bulky ground, very, very bulky. This is I believe, the most specially bulky ground with recovery in the meta. And so you can run something like Earth Power, Shadow Ball, and then either Stealth Rock or Toxic, and then you run Slack Off in the last slot. And this is by far the best especially defensive ground in the meta. It is the best answer to electric types like like Thundurus and Stratosaur. They will never break through you, even though they have good matchups into the other more common electric resistances. The same is true of Magnastone. It is absolutely no way of dealing with Caraguana, so if you are running Caraguana, the matchup into those electric types is much better, though the one electric that Armaldo does do better against is Meganium. Meganium is much stronger into Caraguana than it is into Armaldo, so you do have to keep that in mind when you're building with Caraguana. But generally, Caraguana is used on bulkier teams since it does lack utility compared to Armaldo, especially pivoting. It is a much slower Pokemon at the expense of it does have much higher bulk. So that is the upside of Caraguana. Next, we have Cradily. This is a niche option on bulky teams. It can work well in the right circumstances with Poison Heal. Unfortunately, it is just kind of lacking in utility. There isn't that much that you can do with it. You do have tools like Leech Seed and Toxic, which are very solid, but you don't really have much else. You can also run this as a sticky web setter. I have found it to be all right in that role. It's not great, though. You usually would prefer Servacni, who is faster and runs Focus Sash better. Bulky sticky web options aren't exactly preferred in most cases, so this is very niche. It can work well in the right teams, especially on very bulky teams where you have other walls to back it up, because the big issue with Cradily is Grass Water gives it a lot of very unfortunate weaknesses in this meta, namely Bug and Poison, which is problems for Armaldo, Caracosta, Kabutops. Every single one of those hits you super effectively with stab attacks, which is just very, very bad. The flying weakness is also horrible because Ulti-Combat, Aerodactyl, there's a lot of very strong flying types in the meta, Tornadus as well. It's just not great. Cradily, unfortunately, just does not have the matchups that you really want from a wall in this meta. So it can work at checking some more niche Pokemon. It does very well into like Meganium, for example. It does very well into Heliolisk, but it is just more of a niche option and only fits on certain teams. Next, we have Dracomizer, and this is a very interesting one because this has actually changed a lot from last year, even though the only thing that actually changed was some mild stat buffs. I think a little bit more attack and a little bit more defense was what it got. However, what has really changed for it is the addition of Landorus, because now, instead of using Rough Skin and trying to make this work as a physically defensive Pokemon, which doesn't work very well at all because of that ground and that rock weakness, you can instead run this as an attacker with Sand Rush and the Choice Band item. This does an absurd amount of damage. It is truly, like, there is nothing in the meta that answers this well defensively. Fire Dragon are very good stabs, and then you have Earthquake for coverage. It is truly unbelievable how strong this Pokemon is. Even something like Icaruff gets absolutely folded by Outrage, which makes it one of the best offensive fire types in the meta for that reason. Usually, offensive fires do struggle a lot with Icaruff, but Dracomizer just completely blows past it, especially with Sand Up. The best thing about this Pokemon is its access to Sand Rush, because with this speed tier at +2, you outspeed even Crobat and Aerodactyl, which is very amazing. You are still slower than Scarfers, but most Scarfers can't effectively threaten you because of this absolutely massive natural bulk you have. So Draco Miser can get a lot of value on sand teams with Landorus, with Choice Band. It has sort of had a revival compared to how it was last year. This Pokemon is so much better now that sand is in the meta, and it is a very legitimate option on teams. Next up, we have Espathra. This Pokemon is interesting and a little strange. It hasn't been explored as much as it maybe should have been. The big issue with it is just its lack of bulk and lack of utility. It is not very bulky. Filter does help with that, but it's still not the best, especially when you have Dreadnought as another option for a bulky steel type, who is usually better. You do have Lumina Crash, though, which is a very strong move, and works a lot better on this version of Espathra than it does on base Espathra, because this is more of a utility pivot than a setup sweeper. You also have U-Turn, which is great. That's the pivoting that Dreadnought lacks. And then you have plenty of coverage. You have Flash Cannon if you want to run that. You do have Shadow Ball, which I have used before to help deal with opposing psychic resists, namely... Well, I can't remember now what I was running Shadow Ball for, but I'm sure it was something that made sense. Maybe for opposing psychic types like Espathra as well as Amistar. Shadow Ball is good into both of those. You also have Trick. You can run Trick Choice on this. It hasn't been tested before, but it's probably fine. I've also used this as a Trick Room setter because you do have interesting utility as a Trick Room setter, thanks to... I thought this had Healing Wish. It looks like it does not. What did I run on my Trick Room team? It was... Right. I just ran it with max speed so that it worked as a slow pivot in Trick Room, and again we have Lumina Crash and Shadow Ball. Shadow Ball can be swapped for just about anything. It's a very flexible move slot. So this Pokemon can work on the right builds, but it is very niche, and generally Dreadnought is preferred as a bulky steel type. Next we have, I believe this is Gourgeist Super. Yes, it is. So this is Gourgeist Super, a very strong, slow attacker, and also works well on those Enamorous Trick Room teams I've mentioned before. It's Magic Guard, so you have Life Orb Magic Guard, which is, of course, a great combo. You have access to Nasty Plot. You have Giga Drain for Sustain. You also have Stab Moonblast, which is, of course, great. And then you have Fire Coverage to deal with Steel types who would resist your stabs. Unfortunately, the main issue for this Pokemon is Kabutops and Dreadnought. Dreadnought does not care about fire coverage, and it switches into your stabs very well, and then Kabutops just completely resists everything that you can run. Even if you ran Focus Blast, which is better into Dreadnought, you still have no way of touching Kabutops, and none of your coverage really helps. The most you can do is, like, mixed with High Horsepower, which is very strange and doesn't really do that well because you have 67 base attack. You could also potentially run a stronger grass move. Energy Ball is an option, I believe, but you're still just not going to be doing that much to Kabutops, especially if they're running Assault Vest. So generally this is a strong attacker that just has to deal with the fact that it will never break through Kabutops. So in matchups where Kabutops is on the field, this is just not going to be able to make progress. Next we have Heliolisk, and this is a Pokemon that is a little bit better now than it was last year. Despite not receiving any changes, the big change is just that we have electric terrain in the meta now, which is very nice for Heliolisk, because with Galvanize Boosted Double Edge, you pretty much one-shot everything with electric terrain up that is not an electric immunity. And there are, of course, as discussed before, a lot of electric immunities in the meta, Armaldo and Caracosta being the biggest ones, but Armaldo, you of course have Fire Stab for. You do not have Flare Blitz, but you do have Fire Lash, which in some ways could be considered better. It does, I believe, more damage over 2 turns than Flare Blitz. No, I think it would do slightly less. Over 3 turns it would be equal to Flare Blitz, though, but in the Armaldo matchup you won't be getting 3 turns, so it is a little worse than Flare Blitz would be, but Fire Lash is still a strong attack, and is generally good neutrally. It also does very well into Caracosta. I believe you can almost 2-hit KO it, and I think with the help of Hazards, you will be able to 2-hit KO it with Fire Lash. Usually you will be running Heavy-Duty Boots and Quick Attack and U-Turn and running this as an offensive pivot, but you could also run Choice Band if you want to get a little greedy. I think that's a little harder to run because obviously you are weak to Stealth Rock, and just with the amount of immunities to electric moves in the meta, it can just be hard to justify a choice item on this. I think the Boots pivot set is a lot better. Next, we have Litharium. This is another bulky ground type that is overshadowed by Armaldo. However, Litharium does have some advantages. First off, it is even bulkier than Armaldo, especially on the special side. This is the most specially bulky ground type in the meta, I believe. Even bulkier than Cariguana, even bulkier than Woolifant. There's nothing that is as specially bulky as Litharium. You also have great utility between Knockoff and Toxic, of course, combined with your Ground Stab. Nothing in the meta switches into this well except for Tornadus. Tornadus does, of course, switch into all those. However, Tornadus does not have a great way of threatening you thanks to your very high special bulk, and if you need to, you can run Stone Edge, and this will do a ton of damage to Tornadus, and with its lack of recovery, that is permanent damage, which is very, very valuable. This also does very well into Dreadnought, just due to its very strong ground move. Armaldo is in a similar boat, but Armaldo, of course, does not have access to, or just doesn't have as much bulk as Litharium, and it also does not have access to Comatose. Comatose is the biggest advantage of Litharium. It is completely immune to status. Armaldo is very weak to Toxic, especially Assault Vest sets, so Litharium being fully immune to that can completely screw over their Armaldo counterplay if their counterplay involves statusing Armaldo, because Litharium is just completely immune to that. So there is some logic behind running Litharium over Armaldo, but usually Armaldo is better. Next up we have Salazzle. This is probably the Pokemon that received the biggest glow up from last year. It had a mild buff to its stats, and then it also had Nasty Plot returned to it. So with Nasty Plot, Salazzle is a very good special attacker. You have Freeze Dry and Dark Pulse. This is the most standard set. And then you can also run Ice Beam. You don't exactly get the best coverage, but you also don't really need it. Ice Dark are very strong stabs, and there's basically no switch-in besides Dreadnought. Dreadnought is the big problem for Salazzle, which is why I have personally been running teams that pair Salazzle with Ice, because they kind of deal with each other's counterplay. Ice is a great answer to Dreadnought, or rather, it is a special attacker that Dreadnought cannot answer, which means that teams that rely on Dreadnought as their special wall might be able to answer Salazzle, but they won't be able to answer Ice. And vice versa, because Kabutops is normally a very good answer to Ice, as well as Arctobus also being a very good answer to Ice. However, Kabutops is terrible into Salazzle because Salazzle has Stab Freeze Dry. At +2, this is doing like 80% minimum to Kabutops. It is blowing past it. Even Assault Vest sets cannot win the 1v1. So Salazzle is much better into Kabutops than Ice is, and also removes it for Ice, which is great. And Arctobus, of course, being a ghost type, is weak to Dark, which means Dark Pulse completely destroys it. It is not an effective Ice Resist into Salazzle. These two together cover each other's weaknesses very well, and it makes Ice Spam somewhat of a viable archetype, which I think is very cool. But yeah, Nasty Plot, Salazzle is very solid in the meta. You also have Intimidate, which can be useful for pivoting around strong physical attackers. You can definitely make that work. Salazzle is just generally a very strong option, and I hope to see it more in the tournament. Next we have Shivertherium. This is another very strong Pokemon that was not very strong last year. The biggest thing it received was a major speed buff, and then a couple new moves. But the biggest thing was just the Mountain Gale accuracy buff, making it much more consistent of an attacker. You can run Bulk Up with Mountain Gale, and then you have Earthquake coverage, which is amazing. I usually run High Horsepower, though, because of how common grassy terrain is. And then you also have Steel moves if you want to run them. This can be good for dealing with Bastiodon or Gourgeist, though both of them are also hit super effectively by your other moves, so Iron Head is nowhere near necessary. You can also run Body Press to take advantage of your stamina ability. I think that's a very solid option, especially since Shivertherium can pretty easily eat U-turns or knockoffs from Armaldo or whoever, though you do have to be careful, of course, for ground coverage. Being an Ice Steel type, you are weak to ground, and you don't really need your items, so knockoff is not a big deal. And then you can run Body Press to take advantage of Bulk Up and your stamina boosts. This is a pretty solid physical attacker. It's good at making trades. It just struggles a little bit with some of the top meta threats. Combissa is a big issue for it. It can threaten with High Horsepower on the switch, but Kambissa always revenges it. There is nothing it can do about that. And you also just have other meta fire types, Pokemon like Skeledirge, or fighting types like Archeops and Alta Combat, physical attackers that Shiver Therium cannot deal with, which is very unfortunate for a bulk up stamina Pokemon, having such bad matchups into top physical attackers. So it is a bit niche. It does have bad matchups, but in the right matchup, Ice Ground is always great coverage, so it's hard to go wrong with that. You can also run Stealth Rock if you want. And this is generally a solid tank and trade bot. Moving on to the C+ tiers, we start with Arctobis. This Pokemon has a lot of very good matchups, the biggest one being Felice. This is a hard answer to Felice. Felice has absolutely no way of dealing with Arctobis. And so you can run bulky Calm Mind sets, usually with Permafrost, to help you wall Kabutops as well. With Permafrost, again, Kabutops just has no way of effectively threatening you at all. I don't even know if it has a way of hitting you neutrally. It's that bad of a matchup for the Kabutops user. And then you run Bitter Malice, Frigid Fin, and Recover, usually, with Heavy Duty Boots. And this is a solid set of Pokemon. It just, unfortunately, just lacks the matchups. Ice Ghost could be a lot better defensively than it is. It does give you a few good matchups, but you're also just weak to a lot of things. You're weak to Kambissa. You are weak to Archeops. You're even weak to Dreadnought. Dreadnought usually runs Flash Cannon to help it deal with fairies and ices like Felice. So unfortunately, it is a little bit hard to get set up with Arctobis without just having it die to something like Kambissa or Archeops. And so despite having such good matchups, it is just a little hard to get the value that you would want out of Arctobis. Next we have Goldoco. This is completely outclassed defensively now by Dreadnought and even by Espathra. So for the most part, when you see Goldoco, it is going to be offensive sets with Swords Dance. This is a solid option, especially with Earthquake, and then you do have Ice Punch, which what's good about Ice Punch is that you can combine an answer to Armaldo with flying types. And both of those are an issue for Goldoco, just since it has Earthquake coverage. It really doesn't want to see flying types, especially the biggest problem is Stratosaur and Swishyvish, which completely resist ground and steel combined. And then Armaldo as well, you need something to hit it super effectively, so Ice Punch provides an answer for that. This is a fine set. I mean, 135 attack is hard to go wrong with, but if you're looking at its stats right now, you can see the issue, which is its 50 speed. This works fine on Trick Room. It's all right on Sticky Web, but on anything else, this is just way too slow. The special defense buff did help it a bit. It makes it a little easier to get trades with on the special side into Pokemon like Arctobis or Salazzle, who would have previously been kind of annoying, Moscourge as well. Unfortunately, it is just a little bit too hard to run this Pokemon effectively. Its stats are just a little bit too low, even with that beautifully high attack stat. Being a mono steel type is also just not great offensively. Iron Head is not a very good attack. It could be a lot better than it is, but unfortunately, as it is, it's just too niche to be used on most teams. Next, we have Hemlophosor. This is an interesting Pokemon. People have run bulky variants of this before to take advantage of its unique Poison Grass typing, which does very well into Pokemon like Meganium. Pokemon like it does alright into Kabutops as well, and it would do fine into Dreadnought, but this is a defensive Pokemon, you don't really need to do fine into it. It also does well into Yeezolt, though, which is a very good matchup for it. It is one of very few resists to Yeezolt's stabs, and so you can run bulky sets with Knockoff, Hemlock Hit, Gunk Shot, and then I believe it gets Synthesis, something like this, with Black Sludge, and this is a fine option. Its bulk is a little low for that kind of role, but its typing mostly carries it in that regard. You do also have Merciless, which can be valuable, especially with Hemlock Hit. If you get the Poison proc, then you can completely shear through Pokemon like Armaldo, who would normally answer you. Once they're poisoned, Merciless, making you critical hit every attack, will completely invalidate Intimidate, which is perfect, and Hemlock Hit does a lot of damage then. You can also run Swords Dance sets. Oh, no, you can't. You can run Dragon Dance sets, and these are also fine. It's just a little unfortunate that you're only getting +1 attack each time, because 110 base attack is just a little bit low for that kind of niche, and even at +1 speed, you're just not getting the one-hit KOs that you really need to make it justified. Looking here, even Pokemon like Ulti Combat, I believe, live a hit at +1, which is just very, very unfortunate. Not what you want to see from a Dragon Dance sweeper. So, despite having a very good defensive profile and like a lot of good options for utility just between knockoff and recovery, it does well enough. And then, of course, you just have that poison chance with Merciless, which can be very valuable. Unfortunately, Hemlovasaur just isn't quite there, and it's not usually used on most teams. Next up, we have Meganium. This is a very strong special attacker. If the opponent does not have an answer to it, it kind of just cleaves through teams. And this was also true last year. However, the big difference from last year is that Meganium now has Earth Power, which means it does have a way of threatening Caracosta. This is a massive buff to Meganium, makes it much better of a special attacker, but unfortunately, Caracosta still is only barely 2-hit KO'd by this, and I think with Black Sludge it avoids the 2-hit KO, which is very unfortunate, because Meganium cannot stay in on a Gunk Shot, so you are forced to hard predict around Caracosta, and Armaldo is still a borderline unwinnable matchup. It just does too much with U-turn. You have to click Decibloom every single time, or you will not be able to make progress into it. It is very difficult. Most teams have multiple resists to both of your stabs, so it can be very, very hard to make progress with Meganium. I think it is very strong in the right hands, and with team support it can do very well, but unfortunately its answers are just too common right now. Next up we have Sigilif. This is a niche option on certain teams. It was run last year in tournament, so I won't get too deep into it. You can view the replays from that if you want more information on it. But generally, you'll be running Calm Mind sets, taking advantage of Tinted Lens with Psychic and... and Earth Power. You can also run Choice Scarf, which is pretty valuable. Its stabs are very solid, especially with Tinted Lens. Very few things resist it. And so you can get a lot of value, even into supposed answers like Crobat. A lot of Pokemon that are faster get blown up by Psychic and Ground. Right, you have Pokemon like Archeops, you have Pokemon, even Ulti Combat also gets destroyed by Stab Psychic moves. So this can be a very valuable Scarfer. You also have Trick, which is great into bulkier matchups. You can trick your Scarf away, and then you still have Tinted Lens attacks, including Petroglyph, which can be very, very scary in late game as a cleaner against Stall. Petroglyph does just let you blow past the defensive Pokemon that would normally answer you, with that Torch Song effect of raising the special attack. And so you can get a lot of value with Sigilif in the right matchups. It can be a little difficult just with how low its stats are. It does have some struggles getting in, hitting the field with low bulk. And then its special attack and speed both aren't anything to write home about, so it can be a little hard to get value out of Sigilif, but on the right team it can absolutely put in work. And then finally for C+, we have Tauros. This is a difficult Pokemon to rank. The big problem with Tauros is it just doesn't do enough damage to justify how bad its defensive profile is. Fire Ghost has a lot of really common weaknesses, especially in this meta. You're weak to Rock, you're weak to Ground, you're weak to Water, you're weak to Dark, and you're weak to Ghost. Every single one of those are very common offensive typings in the meta, which is super bad for Tauros. You also have a hard answer in Icaruff. You have absolutely no way of breaking past Icaruff. Even Choice Band, Guerrilla Tactics, Stone Edge is only doing like 55, so they just switch in once, eat the Stone Edge, and then switch out to their Rock Resist. And then the next time it comes in, sure, it'll die, but that means you have to get Tauros in a second time and a third time because, again, you're locked into Stone Edge. Once Icaruff dies, you're not getting another kill. So this is a very difficult Pokemon to get value with. Its game plan is switching in over and over and over again, but it just doesn't have the profile for that because you can't really afford heavy-duty boots. You're not doing enough damage if you have that. And so you have to be weak to rocks, so you have to run this with really strong removal, which is like, it's limiting. And it's just, there are Pokemon that do what this one does much better and with less drawback. So generally, you don't want to be running Tauros. Moving on to the C tiers. These ones are a little sad. They're almost good, but they're just not quite good. We have Bellibolt. This was buffed after the tournament. It does have more optimized stats, and it also now has Earth Power. which is nice. Again, it makes the Caracosta matchup not completely unwinnable. But unfortunately, Electric Dark is just so bad defensively that it's very hard to justify Belly Bolt, even with Nasty Plot, even with Dark Pulse, even with all the moves that it has, even with Earth Power. It is just not enough. Even with Water Absorb, Swishy Vish is now answered by Dreadnought, so you don't really need a defensive Swishy Vish answer, or if you do, you just run Dreadnought. The other matchup that Water Absorb was good for is it was fine into Kabutops as well, but it's just, I mean, of course an electric type is going to be Kabutops. The problem is that you lose to Caracosta and you lose to Armaldo. You don't lose to Caraguana, but Caraguana is barely ever used. So it's like that matchup doesn't actually provide you benefit. It's very tough. Bellybolt is just in a very awkward place in the meta right now. You can run it if you like really like Bellybolt. It has rapid spin, it has slack off, it has like utility, but it's just not enough. It does have toxic. You could potentially run a nasty plot toxic set and to take advantage of Armaldo, but it's just not there. This Pokemon is very hard to justify. Next we have Chimeragon. This is another new addition, but unfortunately it's one of the biggest flops of the new additions. This is a strong Pokemon on paper. It does have access to Quiver Dance with a strong offensive profile. You have Bug Buzz, you have Draco Meteor, you have Dragon Pulse, and you have Hydro Steam and Hurricane as coverage, which are very solid. You did lose Flamethrower from base Walking Wake, but you can still make up for it with this coverage. The problem, well, there's really two problems. You also have Scathing Swarm, which is a Make It Rain clone. The problem, though, is, first of all, Dreadnought. You have nothing. You have no way of hitting Dreadnought. You have absolutely zero way of threatening Dreadnought. You can't even... Look at this. This is absurd. You can't even hit it neutrally. You have to run Mud Shot. Mud Shot to threaten Dreadnought. You know how much that's doing? At +1, that's doing like 35. Like, it's ridiculous. It does no damage. And Dreadnought is just way too bulky for this Pokemon to effectively deal with. Its attacks above like 60 base power all are resisted by Dreadnought. It's truly absurd. Dreadnought just completely shuts down everything this Pokemon wants to do. You have no way of threatening it. And then the other problem is the bulk. 61, 80, 80. Abysmal bulk. That's like almost Dugtrio level bulk. Like, that is so bad. This has no setup opportunities. It never gets a chance to set up. So even though you have Quiver Dance, even though you have like fine enough coverage outside of the Dreadnought matchup, you just cannot get set up with this ever. So the other issue is that Hydro Steam would of course be good if we had Sun, but we don't have Sun. So Chimeragon, just very, very hard to run effectively. Usually other options are going to be better. If you want to set up Sweeper, there's better options. Even Hemlophosor is better. Don't run Chimeragon usually. Next up we have Conkeldurr. This Pokemon's fine. I mean, it works in certain matchups. The big thing that it has is Punk Rock like Nymphomane. However, unlike Nymphomane, it has Focus Blast, so it can directly threaten Dreadnought. And that's a big niche to have. The problem is just your stats are too low. Your speed is very awkward. Your special attack isn't that high, even with Punk Rock. Neutral walls are going to be doing just fine into you. Caracosta is going to be a problem. There's just... Your special bulk is also your special bulk is fine. Your physical bulk is also very low, so Caracosta is going to be doing a lot of damage with Knockoff and Gunk Shot, and then Armaldo as well. You can't switch into it, even though you want to be able to threaten it with your water moves. You can't do that, because if it clicks U-Turn, you're losing like 30% of your HP, and if it clicks Earthquake, you're getting 2-shot. Like, it does way too much damage to you. Conkeldurr would be a lot better if it had better physical bulk, but because it doesn't, it is very, very hard to justify. Even with like Life Orb, Choice Specs, whatever, it's too slow for most teams. That fighting weakness is horrible because, again, Archeops, Ultra Combat both threaten you very effectively. It's just, yeah, it could be a lot better than it is, but right now it's just not it in most cases. Next up is Lapras. This Pokemon was already bad when it was outclassed by Kabutops, but now it's not just outclassed by Kabutops, it's also outclassed by Dreadnought. And both of these Pokemon are just way better than Lapras. Like, if you want an answer to Salazzle, Lapras is a bad option because it's weak to Freeze Dry. Whereas Dreadnought is a good option because it's not weak to Freeze Dry. That was the main niche, right, over Kabutops, is Lapras at least, like, resists Salazzle's stabs. So, like, even if you're weak to freeze dry, like you still have a lot of bulk, so like you can make it work, you know. Or what would be another good option or a good matchup for Lapras? Oh, what about offensive Kabutops? Lapras is good into that. Yeah, well, offensive Kabutops is dead in the water because of Dreadnought, so it doesn't even exist anymore. And then Water Dark is just very awkward defensively in the meta. Literally every top offensive mon hits you super effectively. Every single one of them. Armaldo does. Combissa does. Yeezel, Archeops, Ultra Combat, Felice, Magnastone. All of them hit you super effectively. Every single one of them. Gourgeist as well. It's the worst defensive type you could possibly have in this meta. Like, I cannot name a worse defensive type. The only things you match up well into in the top tiers are like Aerodactyl, who's not an offensive mon. You do fine into Tyrantrum, but even then you don't want to switch into Draconic Ren. That's going to be doing like 40. And then Caracosta looks good on paper, but you don't really want to get knocked off. So, and Gunk Shot's going to be doing a ton. So there's just no good matchups in the top tiers for Lapras. There's literally no reason to run it over Dreadnought. Dreadnought does its job way better. Even into lower tier options like Swishy Fish, who Lapras does fine into, Dreadnought does even better. You know, even options like Salazzle, like I mentioned, Dreadnought is way better. There's just no justifiable reason to run Lapras when you could be running Dreadnought. But I'm putting it above D because the D tiers are, well, we'll get to them. Anyway, next up we have Rhyperior. It's very hard to justify this Pokemon. I have seen Assault Vest sets be fine, but Electric is just not a very good type in this meta. Electric Dragon, even more so, not a good type. You are completely hard-walled by both Bastiodon and Gourgeist, and both of them also threaten you, so that's not great. You do have Terravolt as an option, so you can actually bypass Caracosta's electric immunity, but that's not even that valuable because you have Earthquake anyway. Or no, you have Earth Power, sorry. You already have options, you have high horsepower, you have ways of hitting Caracosta, so it's like there's not even any point to having Terravolt at that point. Even your Dragon Stab is doing enough. You don't need to click electric moves. And you're not running Volt Switch on this. It only has 55 special attack. So it's a very awkward Pokemon. I've seen people run Assault Vest sets, and they do fine. You have like a ton of coverage. So there are like sets you can run that can make good trades. Your stabs are not good, though. Not at all. I mean, you have Supercell Slam, and then you have, what, Outrage? You're not running Outrage. Like, you'd have to run like Dragon Tail. Maybe on Hazard Stack, that's fine. But it's obviously very weak, which makes you easy to switch into. You're really reliant on coverage to deal damage. So if they have a strong neutral wall that isn't weak to your coverage, you're not going to have a way of breaking past it. This is a very awkward Pokemon. Very hard to get value out of. In the right matchup, it can be fine, but usually it's just not doing enough. Next we have Servacni. This is the best Sticky Web setter in the tier, but it doesn't do anything else. And Sticky Web isn't even that good. We have a ton of very viable Rapid Spinners, so it's hard to keep webs on the field. And Trick Room is generally better if you're trying to take advantage of speed tiers like that. So Servacni is very hard to justify. Enamorus does just kind of completely outclass it because Trick Room is actually pretty viable in this meta. So Sticky Web is like, why even bother? I mean, in the Trick Room matchup, Sticky Web is horrible. Like, you don't even want to set it. But even outside of the Trick Room matchup, Trick Room is just usually better for taking advantage of slow attackers. Like, even Aurorus would do better on a Trick Room team than it would on a Sticky Web team. And then, with how common removal is, it is just very hard to get value with Sticky Webs these days and to keep them on the field long enough, especially with Servacni, who mostly operates as a suicide lead. But the problem is, it's a suicide hazard lead that has to run Crab Hammer to hit Armaldo. And even then, that's doing like 35 at -1. It's really rough. Servacni doesn't have good matchups in the top tiers. It is very, very niche. The only time you run it, even with Rain in the meta, I've tried it with Rain. It's not good. The only time you run it is as a Sticky Web setter, and it's not even very good at that job, to the point where Cradilly, who is also not a good Sticky Web setter, gives it competition, which is just, yeah. Servacni's not good. Run it if you want to run Sticky Web. Otherwise, don't run it at all. And even on Sticky Web, you don't want to run it. Like, it's just bad. It's just bad. Next up, we have Swampert. This Pokemon used to be better. Unfortunately, at this point, I think its stats are just letting it down. It's a pretty good Pokemon with Assault Vest. It can trade well, or at least it used to be able to. These days, its bulk is just lacking. and it doesn't have resistances for the most part. It's very hard to get value with. It doesn't resist electric as an electric type, which is unfortunate. It's a water type, but it's weak to ground. The ground weakness is just a death sentence for most of its matchups, especially into physical attackers. You pretty much can only use this to beat special attackers, but again, you don't resist electric, which is like the most common special attacking type in this meta. I mean, look at this. Thunderous, Magnastone, Meganium, Belly Bolt, I guess. Like, all of these, as well as Stratosaur, all of these beat you. So it's like, not great, you know? Combissa as well. Would be a good answer to Combissa, but you don't resist fighting, so Focus Blast is doing a million. And then the physical attackers that are more common in the meta all beat you. So it's just like, it's very hard to get value with Swampert. It doesn't have the matchups anymore that it used to have. As more special attackers have been added, it's become a less effective special wall because it doesn't beat all the new Pokemon. It does fine into Felice. Felice is a solid matchup for it, but it's just very hard to justify, especially with Dreadnought in the meta as a much better, especially defensive water type. So Swampert ends up in a similar boat to Lapras, where it's just not valuable enough to run. And finally, we have the D tiers. There is no reason to run any of these on your team. Like, no justification. Even the C tiers, like maybe on the right team, you can make them work. These D tiers have no value. We have Base Gourgeist. It's a stamina Pokemon, but like, just run Shivertherium. This is so weak. Its stats are horrible. It has no value. Like, it has higher attack than special attack, so, oh, I'll run Swords Dance. But you have 95 speed, which is so awkward. Like, if you want to run Swords Dance, run Small. Gourgeist Small is a great Swords Dance user. You have no reason to run regular, because stamina is great and all until they run a poison type, and then you're dead, right? If they come in with Kabutops, I think Kabutops naturally outspeeds you. That's a speed tie. But either way, if they're running a poison type or a Dreadnought, like, you really want to have Small, because like the extra like 15 attack or whatever it is, or I guess the extra 11 attack, makes a big difference. So, especially with Fairy Aura. So there's just not really any reason to run this. If you want to run it as bulky Pokemon, Large is better as the Grassy Surge setter. Way better. It's just, don't run this. Next up, we have No Chummer. This is completely outclassed by Tyrantrum, and it is just impossible to get value with. It doesn't beat Armaldo. In fact, it loses to Armaldo. It loses to just about every physical wall in the meta. The only thing it even does well into is Aerodactyl. And even then, not really. If you're running Choice Band, then one of your stabs, Aerodactyl, is completely immune, which is awful. We have so many options for knockoff in the meta that even that doesn't really make it stand out. I mean, just look at how many Pokemon get knockoff. Why would you run No Chummer when we have all of these other options? Ungabungus also completely outclasses it as a knockoff user. Its stats are just not very good. They're very mediocre across the board. The only thing that stands out is its attack. But again, Ungabungus has almost the same level of attack. Why would you not just run that? That has so much more value. Night Watch is like the big thing for it. But again, Crobat exists. Crobat is a much better user of Night Watch, because Crobat uses it to break past Caracosta. No Chummer breaks past Caracosta by just clicking Double Edge. You don't even need Night Watch for that. So it's just, you're not getting value with it. I guess. Oh, and then Ungabungus is the Pokemon that you would want Night Watch for, right? Because Tyrantrum struggles with Ungabungus. So it's like, oh, okay, I'll run this as like a Tyrantrum that beats Ungabungus at the expense of not having Dragon Dance. Ungabungus has neutralizing gas. You don't even get Night Watch against it. There is no point in this Pokemon. This Pokemon should not exist. It does nothing. There is no point in running this. It is always outclassed. There is always something that does its job better. This is truly awful. Do not run it. And finally, we have Nurturaptor. This Pokemon used to be maybe justifiable on certain teams as a Wish Passer, but Dreadnought exists now. Why would you run it? And Dreadnought exists. Dreadnought is a way better Wish Passer. Dreadnought has, I think, more HP. Base 80 versus base 90. Yeah, so Dreadnought has more HP, has Regenerator. It doesn't have Pivoting, but that doesn't matter. It does so much more better. And then if you wanted one with Pivoting anyway, you just run Ikaruff. I believe Ikaruff gets U-turn. Oh, no, it doesn't. Okay, so if you want a Wish Passer with Pivoting, you can run Nurturaptor. But that is just, there's no point. There's no point. That's not a niche that is needed in this meta. And the problem with Nurturaptor is it cannot beat Dreadnought. It does no damage. Base 85 special attack is just not enough. Now that we have real steel types in the meta, normal dragon is super lackluster. You're weak to fighting. You're weak to fairy. all the top offensive mons beat you, yada yada. It's the same thing I've been saying for all of these other Pokemon, but even worse. So there's just not really any reason to run Nurture Raptor in this meta. It is too understated for what it brings to the table, and it will not gain value on almost any team. So unfortunately, it's just not worth running at all. And that is the full overview of Paleomons right now. I hope y'all found this video informative. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. You know how it is. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the tournament, and I hope to see you all there.